North Atlantic, winter of 1952. The gray sea heaves under a cold sky. Wind tears across the deck of HMS Triumph, carrying salt spray that bites at exposed skin. On the flight deck, crewmen crouch low, faces turned away from the screaming jet engine of a Sea Vampire fighter. Its nose points not straight down the ship's length, but slightly to the left. An odd angle. A risk no one has ever taken before. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Commander Eric Winkle Brown grips the throttle. The carrier rolls with the swell, pitching unpredictably. Brown steadies his breathing. Below him, sailors wait in silence. The radio crackles, cleared for landing. He lines up, not with the ship, but against it. Engines roar. Tires screech. The jet slams down at an angle and hooks on. History changes in that instant. By the end of the Second World War, the aircraft carrier had become the new king of naval warfare. Battleships, once the pride of empires, now bowed before the reach of carrier-based air power. From the Pacific to the Mediterranean, floating airfields had determined the fate of entire fleets. But victory carried a hidden problem. The propeller-driven fighters and bombers that had ruled the skies in 1945 were already becoming obsolete. Within just a few years, jet engines were rewriting the laws of flight. Faster, heavier, hungrier. The same technology that promised dominance in the skies threatened to cripple the very carriers meant to launch them. The U.S. Navy's first operational jet, the F-H-1 Phantom, took off easily enough from a carrier. Landing, however, was another story. A straight deck, the long, narrow runway running from bow to stern, left no room for error. Jets approached at almost twice the speed of propeller planes. One mistake meant disaster. A missed arrestor wire could send an aircraft plowing into parked planes ahead or over the side into the sea. By 1949, carrier landings had become deadly. Reports showed accidents rising sharply. Pilots feared the deck more than the enemy. Veteran commanders described post-war carrier flight ops as organized chaos. The new jet age demanded a solution, one that didn't yet exist. Across the Atlantic, the Royal Navy faced the same dilemma. Britain's Sea Vampire and Seahawk jets, though smaller than their American counterparts, shared the same dangerous habits: high landing speeds, poor low-speed control, and minimal visibility over long carrier noses. Every landing became a gamble. Naval engineers began experimenting with all sorts of desperate measures. Some proposed longer decks. Others imagined hydraulic launch systems or automatic landing aids. But none solved the core problem: the geometry of the carrier itself. The straight deck, perfect for slower aircraft, had become a death trap for jets. By the early 1950s, both navies were suffering heavy losses during peacetime operations. The idea of maintaining a carrier fleet in the jet age seemed increasingly unrealistic. Air marshals questioned the future of naval aviation altogether. Maybe, one senior officer warned in 1951, the carrier's era is over. But among those who refused to give up were a few restless innovators, test pilots and engineers who believed the solution was not to abandon carriers, but to rethink them. The spark of that rethinking would come not from an admiral or a scientist, but from a man with both flight hours and imagination: Captain Dennis Campbell of the Royal Navy. Captain Dennis Campbell, Royal Navy test pilot and carrier commander, had seen enough crashes to know that something fundamental had to change. The answer, he realized, wasn't about more powerful brakes, better arrestor wires, or stronger aircraft. It was about geometry. In 1951, Campbell began to study the carrier deck itself. Watching endless replays of landing footage, he noticed the same fatal pattern. Pilots lined up directly with the ship's center line. If they missed the arrestor wires, they had nowhere to go but straight into the parked aircraft at the bow. There was no margin for error, no room for escape. But what if, he thought, the landing path wasn't perfectly straight? What if the flight deck itself angled away from the ship's axis, just a few degrees to port? That way, a missed landing wouldn't mean destruction ahead. The aircraft could simply throttle up and fly off safely. It was a simple but radical thought. Land backwards to the ship's course, not along it. In early 1952, Campbell's idea reached the Admiralty's experimental branch. Engineers and designers were skeptical. The deck was already crowded with catapults, elevators, and safety nets. Angling it seemed like madness, the kind of idea that existed only in theory. But Campbell insisted on testing it. The Royal Navy's carrier HMS Triumph, a veteran of the Korean War, was chosen as the test ship. The solution was almost laughably crude. Engineers painted a white line diagonally across the deck, just 8.5 degrees off the center line, and told the pilots to land as if that were the true runway. On a cold day over the North Atlantic, Lieutenant Commander Eric Winkle Brown, one of the world's most experienced test pilots, made history. Lining up with the painted line, he approached not the ship's bow, but its angled deck. The carrier rolled violently, waves crashing beneath. The crew held their breath. Brown's jet touched down, wheels screeching, arrestor hook catching perfectly. The plane stopped safely, with clear deck space ahead. No parked aircraft in the way, no collision risk. The angled deck worked. Within weeks, British engineers built a mock-up of a permanent angled deck aboard the HMS Centaur, testing catapults, arresting gear, and landing aids under the new configuration. The results were revolutionary. Not only did the new layout improve safety, it also allowed carriers to launch and recover aircraft simultaneously, something impossible before. News of the success spread quickly. The U.S. Navy, facing the same crisis with its new F-9F Panthers and F-2H Banshees, sent observers to Britain. What they saw would reshape naval warfare for generations. By 1952's end, the USS Antietam CV-36 was modified with an experimental angled flight deck, the first of its kind in America. The experiment confirmed what Campbell had imagined. Jets could now land safely, quickly, and efficiently. It was more than an engineering fix. It was the dawn of a new philosophy, that innovation could come from rethinking old ideas, not abandoning them. And as navies across the world raced to adapt this new concept, another challenge emerged: training pilots to master this strange, counterintuitive art, landing backwards on a moving ship. The shift from straight deck to angled deck carriers was more than a structural change. It was a psychological revolution. The human angle. Learning to land backwards for the pilots. Everything they had learned about carrier landings suddenly felt wrong. On a straight deck, they lined up perfectly with the ship's bow, trusting instinct and muscle memory. But now, the landing path was skewed. The ship's superstructure appeared offset. The horizon felt twisted. From the cockpit, it looked as if they were about to crash into the sea. Training manuals called it approach vector adjustment. Pilots called it madness. Lieutenant Commander Brown later described those first weeks of angled deck practice as fighting the brain's own compass. Every natural instinct screamed to correct the approach back toward the ship's center line, precisely the move that could end in disaster. The U.S. Navy established intensive landing training programs on the Antietam and later on the Forrestal-class carriers. Dozens of young aviators were taught to unlearn what years of flight had drilled into them. Flight instructors used crude chalkboard diagrams, explaining how to aim not at the carrier's bow, but toward a point off its port side. Each landing became an act of trust, not only in one's skill, but in the engineers who had dared to tilt the very surface of the sea. Many pilots admitted the angled deck saved their lives. A missed wire no longer meant death. They could throttle up, go around, and try again. confidence began to return to naval aviation. The deck no longer felt like a trap. It became a challenge they could master. The technological angle, the mirror that saved lives alongside the new deck geometry, came another breakthrough. A device that looked almost trivial, yet changed everything. The mirror landing aid. Developed by British engineer Lieutenant Commander HCN Nick Goodhart, the system used a gyroscopically stabilized concave mirror, flanked by rows of amber and red lights. A pilot approaching the carrier could see a glowing ball of light reflected in the mirror, the meatball. If the ball stayed level with the reference lights, the pilot was on the correct glide path. If it rose or sank, he was too high or too low. For the first time, pilots had real-time visual feedback during landing, replacing the crude bat signals of deck officers waving paddles. The mirror landing aid paired perfectly with the angled deck. Together they turned a deadly guessing game into a system of precision. When the U.S. Navy adopted the mirror system in 1955, accident rates fell dramatically. Carrier landings, once described as controlled crashes, became controlled science. Technicians across the fleet fine-tuned the mirrors for different sea conditions and aircraft types. Night landings, once the ultimate test of nerve, became safer and more predictable. The human factor was still there, but now supported by reliable technology. One test pilot summarized it best. The angled deck gave us space to fail. The mirror gave us the power to succeed. With these twin innovations, naval aviation had not only survived the jet age, it had reinvented itself. But innovation in war is never just about engineering. It's also about strategy, how new tools reshape combat itself. The angled deck was about to do far more than save lives. It would redefine how carriers fought, deployed, and projected power across the world's oceans. 3. The tactical angle. Turning the carrier into a war machine. Again, before the angled deck, every landing halted flight operations. Planes had to be cleared from the deck before another could land, turning the world's most powerful ships into stop-and-go airfields. But now, something extraordinary became possible. With an 8-degree tilt, the flight deck gained a split personality, launch and recovery at the same time. While one jet thundered off the bow, another could be landing on the angled portion aft. Sortie rates, the number of missions a carrier could fly in a day, doubled almost overnight. In combat terms, that meant dominance. For the U.S. Navy during the Cold War, this wasn't just convenience, it was survival. Nuclear-armed bombers, long-range Soviet submarines, and fast-moving fleets demanded constant air cover. The angled deck transformed the carrier from a vulnerable experiment into a continuous strike platform. Deck crews learned to choreograph their movements with machine-like precision. Catapults hissed, arrestor cables snapped taut, and elevators lifted aircraft between hangar and deck in a ballet of steel and speed. The angled landing zone became the heartbeat of a new doctrine: keep the deck alive. 2. The leadership angle. Visionaries. Who refused to quit. Every military revolution begins with people who see beyond failure. Captain Dennis Campbell had the vision, but it took the conviction of admirals to make it real. In Washington, Admiral Arleigh Burke, then Chief of Naval Operations, immediately grasped the concept's potential. Burke had commanded destroyers in World War II and knew the terror of facing enemy aircraft without air cover. He pushed hard for the U.S. Navy to adopt Britain's angled deck, even when skeptics warned it would cost millions and complicate logistics. Burke's response was blunt. If the deck kills pilots, it's already too expensive. In Britain, Vice Admiral Sir Caspar John championed Campbell's vision within the Royal Navy. He faced similar resistance: budget cuts, old traditions, political fatigue after the war. Yet he persisted. Under his leadership, The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm became the testing ground for almost every major post-war naval aviation advance. Steam catapults, mirror landing systems, and reinforced angled decks. These men didn't just alter ships. They altered thinking. Their persistence ensured that the carrier, once thought doomed, would not just survive the jet age, but dominate it. The enemy angle. The Soviet watch across the Iron Curtain. Soviet naval observers watched in uneasy fascination. In the early 1950s, the USSR's carrier ambitions lagged far behind the West. Their fleet relied heavily on land-based bombers like the Tu-16 Badger and missile cruisers for sea. Denial. When Western carriers began launching jets continuously from angled decks, Soviet analysts realized the strategic imbalance was widening. U.S. carriers could now maintain near-permanent air patrols, extending power deep into contested waters. Declassified Soviet reports from the era describe a radical restructuring of sea aviation tactics in response. Moscow began exploring designs for hybrid carriers and VTOL aircraft, hoping to bypass the need for large decks altogether. But the truth was clear. The West had found a winning formula. The angled deck gave carriers agility. The mirror landing aid gave them precision, and leadership gave them purpose. Together, they formed the backbone of naval dominance that would endure through the Cold War and beyond. The transformation was complete in concept, but not yet proven in battle. The real test would come when these new decks faced the raw, unforgiving reality of operational conditions, storms, combat, night operations, and human fatigue. It was time to see if this backwards landing revolution could truly survive the chaos of the open sea. HMS Triumph, North Atlantic, 1952. The sea is restless, the ship heaving against gray, rolling swells. On her deck, lines of men brace against icy wind, eyes fixed on the tiny shape approaching from the clouds. A de Havilland sea vampire, jet number VX-120. At the controls sits Lieutenant Commander Eric Winkle Brown, the Royal Navy's most experienced test pilot. Over 2,000 deck landings behind him, but none like this. Below him, engineers have painted an angled white line across the deck, 8.5 degrees off the ship's center line. No structural change, no fancy gear, just paint and courage. The ship pitches sharply as Brown lowers his flaps. His mind races through calculations: wind speed, carrier roll, approach angle. The landing signal officer watches, helpless. There's no precedent for this. Brown aligns with the diagonal line, the ship's bow looming unnaturally to his right. Every instinct screams to correct his heading, but he holds steady. The deck rushes toward him, tires slam down. Hook catches. The jet jerks to a stop, perfectly aligned with the angled deck. For the first time in history, a jet lands safely without threatening the aircraft parked ahead. The crew erupts in cheers. Brown shuts down the engine and climbs out, a thin smile breaking the tension. "She handled beautifully," he reports. Naval aviation has just been reborn. Within weeks, more tests follow. British engineers refine the concept, adjusting arrestor wire positions and recalculating deck markings. Each trial reinforces the same truth. The angled deck works. In the United States, word spreads quickly through naval intelligence. The U.S. Navy, fighting to modernize its massive carrier fleet, sends observers to Britain. Among them is Captain L.F. Leslie Knapp, who returns to Washington convinced, "We must test this immediately." The Navy's chosen test bed, the USS Antietam, CV-36, a veteran of World War II. In the summer of 1952, shipyard workers at the New York Naval Shipyard cut, welded, and reconfigured her flight deck, the first true angled deck carrier in American history. By October, she was ready. Painted lines became reinforced steel, arrestor wires repositioned, and mirror landing aids installed. The world's first operational angled flight deck gleamed under the autumn sun. When test pilot Sea Dr. Don P. Moon lined up for the first jet approach, tension filled the ship. Officers stood silently along the island superstructure. The ship's captain, Thomas S. Combs, later recalled, "We were watching not just a landing, but the future of our Navy." The F-9F Panther descended. Tailhook extended. The ship rolled. The mirror lights steadied. Moon caught the third wire cleanly. A flawless angled landing. The Antietam crew erupted in applause. Engineers had proven what many had dismissed as impossible. A few weeks later, the ship performed a mixed operation, launching one jet off the bow while another landed on the angled deck aft. It worked perfectly. For the first time, a carrier could operate like a true airport at sea, with simultaneous launch and recovery. The revolution that began with a painted white line now had steel, doctrine, and proof. But this success brought new challenges. Integrating the system across the world's fleets, retraining thousands of pilots, and testing the limits of what these angled decks could truly endure under combat and storm. The technology had passed the test. Now it had to survive the ocean. By 1953, the success of Antietam and Triumph was undeniable. The angled deck was no longer an experiment. It was a revolution waiting to be scaled. The Royal Navy moved first. Shipyards at Portsmouth and Devonport began retrofitting active carriers, HMS Centaur, HMS Eagle, and HMS Ark Royal, each receiving the new deck geometry, reinforced arresting gear, and improved mirror landing systems. Engineers integrated steam catapults, allowing heavier, faster jets to launch with ease. The British called it Project Jet Carrier. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy committed fully. The massive Forrestal-class supercarriers, USS Forrestal, USS Saratoga, USS Ranger, and USS Independence, were designed from the keel up with angled decks, deck-edge elevators, and dual catapults. These were not conversions. They were the first ships built for the jet age. Every navy that watched took notes. The French Navy began modifying Clemenceau. The Australians planned changes for HMAS Melbourne. Even Japan's post-war naval designers, restricted by treaty, studied the configuration for future projects. But behind the celebration lay a sobering reality. Training. Landing on an angled deck required an entirely new way of thinking. Thousands of naval aviators, trained for straight-deck approaches, now had to relearn everything. Approach speeds, glide paths, visual cues. The new meatball mirror system became the center of flight school training. Instructors drilled one mantra into every pilot's head. Keep the ball centered. Trust the mirror, not your instincts. Many failed. Some panicked mid-approach, overcorrected, and missed the wires. Others froze, unable to unlearn years of straight-deck muscle memory. But those who adapted became the finest carrier aviators of their generation. The angled deck didn't just test machines, it tested men. Meanwhile, ship crews also had to evolve. The choreography of carrier operations changed completely. Deck handling teams coordinated simultaneous launch and recovery cycles, while new foul line markings ensured aircraft stayed clear of landing zones. Commanders learned to calculate deck wind angles, adjusting ship headings to maintain safe approaches. The change touched every corner of naval aviation, from design bureaus to deck crews, from pilots to admirals. By 1955, nearly every major carrier in the Western world either had an angled deck or was scheduled for conversion. What began as a British experiment had become a global standard. The payoff came quickly. During joint exercises in the Mediterranean, the USS Forrestal demonstrated what the new configuration could truly achieve. Over a 48-hour period, the carrier launched and recovered more than 400 jet sorties without interruption, an operational tempo previously thought impossible. Observers described the flight deck as a living machine, its rhythm unbroken, its precision unmatched. It wasn't just efficiency, it was survivability. If an aircraft missed the wires or lost control, it no longer risked colliding with others on deck. The angled landing path provided a natural escape, a vital margin of safety in the unpredictable chaos of war at sea. This transformation didn't go unnoticed. The Soviet Navy, monitoring from afar, recognized the strategic shift. American and British carriers were now effectively unsinkable air bases, capable of maintaining continuous air presence far from home. By the late 1950s, the angled deck was not just a technical innovation. It was a doctrine. It defined carrier operations for the next century. From the cold, gray waters of the Atlantic to the tropical heat of the Pacific, every successful landing, every roaring jet recovery, traced its lineage back to that one daring test flight aboard HMS Triumph. The ocean had been conquered again, this time by ingenuity tilted just 8 degrees off-center. By the end of the 1950s, the angled flight deck was no longer a novelty. It was a new law of the sea. What began as a white line painted across HMS Triumph had become the blueprint for every major carrier in service. The Royal Navy, once struggling to justify its relevance in the jet age, suddenly found itself leading a global transformation. Every operational British carrier, Ark Royal, Eagle, Centaur, and later Hermes, adopted the angled configuration. Pilots who once feared the deck now spoke of it with pride. "It gives you a way out," one aviator said. For the first time, the ship isn't fighting you, it's helping you. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy moved faster and bigger. From 1955 onward, every American carrier entering service, from the mighty Forrestal class to the later Enterprise and Nimitz class, bore the angled deck as its defining feature. The transformation was so rapid that within a decade, not a single operational American carrier remained with a straight flight deck. The numbers told their own story. Before 1952, carrier landing accident rates in both British and U.S. navies averaged one crash every 30 to 40 landings. By 1958, that figure dropped to one in several hundred. The angled deck, combined with mirror landing aids, had reduced fatalities by more than 70% across both fleets. For flight deck crews, often forgotten in the glamour of naval aviation, the change was just as profound. The risk of being struck by runaway aircraft or jet blasts decreased dramatically. Launch and recovery coordination became systematic, safer, almost rhythmic. Foreign navies followed quickly. The French Navy retrofitted its carriers Clemenceau and Foch with 8-degree angled decks. The Royal Australian Navy applied the same to HMAS Melbourne, while Canada's HMCS Bonaventure joined the ranks soon after. Even nations with smaller fleets like Brazil and Argentina modified their carriers to adopt the same geometry. For a brief moment in naval history, the world's greatest sea powers, rivals and allies alike, stood united in one truth. The angled deck had saved the carrier. What might have been the end of an era, instead, became its rebirth. The carrier was no longer just a floating runway. It was now a precision machine, capable of sustaining jet operations day and night, in peace or war. But history would soon test these new designs in a way that no exercise or experiment could predict. In the storms and combat sorties of the coming decades, from the South China Sea to the Gulf of Tonkin, the angled deck had proven its concept. Now, it would prove its endurance. The 1960s brought the first real test of the angled deck in war. Over the skies of Vietnam, U.S. Navy carriers like the USS Forrestal, USS Hancock, and USS Enterprise launched thousands of sorties deep into hostile territory. day after day, night after night. Here, the true value of the angled deck became undeniable. Pilots returning from missions, often low on fuel and flying damaged aircraft, could now attempt landings with far greater safety. A missed wire no longer spelled disaster. They could simply power up, go around, and try again. The results were striking. Despite the intense operational tempo, the Navy recorded historically low loss rates for carrier recoveries. The angled deck had turned chaotic, high-risk war operations into an efficient, disciplined routine. During the 1967 fire aboard USS Forrestal, when explosions tore through the deck, the ship's layout, including its angled landing zone, allowed emergency crews to isolate the damage and continue limited operations. It was a stark reminder that the angled configuration wasn't just an improvement for pilots. It was a design that could save ships and crews under catastrophe. The Royal Navy's carriers soon demonstrated similar resilience. During exercises in the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean, British Sea Vixens and Buccaneers performed hundreds of landings in rough seas that would have been impossible on pre-war decks. Fleet commanders began referring to the angled deck not as an innovation, but as a requirement, the heart of modern naval aviation. By the 1970s, every major carrier nation on Earth had embraced the concept. Even the Soviet Union, initially skeptical, began experimenting with hybrid angled decks on ships like the Kiev class, blending jet and VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing operations. The principle spread beyond military circles. Civilian naval designers studied the idea for potential use in ocean-based research platforms and floating runways. The angled deck had transcended warfare. It had become a symbol of adaptation. By the time the USS Nimitz, CVN-68, entered service in 1975, the concept was perfected. An 8.5-degree angled deck, optical landing system, and automated approach radar, all direct descendants of Dennis Campbell's sketch on a sheet of paper more than 2 decades earlier. The carriers of the Cold War, and later the modern age, owed their very existence to that simple idea. Give pilots a second chance. And though technology would continue to evolve, from steam catapults to electromagnetic launch systems, from mirror sights to advanced landing optics, one thing never changed. Every jet that landed safely on a carrier did so on the legacy of that angled deck. The age of straight landings was over. The age of innovation and survival had begun. History often turns on moments that, at first, seem insignificant. A pilot landing at a slight angle, a naval architect sketching a new deck line in pencil. But within those small acts lies the quiet revolution that reshapes the world. The angled flight deck was not born from ambition. It was born from necessity. The jet age had rendered carriers obsolete overnight. And yet, through courage, logic, and persistence, men like Eric Winkle Brown and Captain Dennis Campbell refused to accept that fate. Their idea gave airmen something they had never truly had before: forgiveness. The sea was no longer an unforgiving wall of steel waiting to claim another aircraft. It was a moving runway that worked with the pilot, not against him. That change transformed more than just flight operations. It redefined naval warfare. It allowed nations to project power farther, faster, and with greater safety than ever before. The angled deck became a universal standard, not because it was easy, but because it worked. And perhaps, in that truth, lies the deeper human story. Innovation in war is rarely about glory. It's about survival. It's about adapting faster than the danger that hunts you. Every time a pilot lands on a modern carrier, guided by optical systems, radar cues, and invisible lines of data, he's still tracing the same angled path drawn in 1952 by a handful of visionaries staring at the gray Atlantic. A simple turn of perspective, a new way to face the wind, and the beginning of a safer, smarter world at sea.